Okay, we are live.
All right, welcome back to the House Environment Committee. We are going to shift gears and talk about chloride contamination with two scientists from Vermont who have been working on this issue. To begin with, I understand Matthew Vaughn would like to go first. Does that work for both of you? Okay, great. Welcome.
It does. Thank you. And thanks to Chris for your flexibility.
Sure thing.
All right, you ready for me to share my screen?
We are.
All right, just a moment while I make that happen. I am traveling right now, so I'm not in my usual setup, but I think I can make it work.
Really, because I think the ice is probably out on Lake Champlain.
That's right, yeah. There's probably some ice around there somewhere. Okay. Are you all seeing that okay?
We are. We're not quite. Yeah, there we are. That looks good.
All right, and I've got Zoom stuff all over my screen, so let me clean that up. Okay, that should do it. So thank you for having me. My name is Matthew Vaughn. I'm the chief scientist at the Lake Champlain Basin Program. I've been asked to speak to you today about the water quality impacts of de-icing salt on Lake Champlain and its tributaries. This has been a really, I think it's important. There's been a lot of interest in it, rightfully. So I'm happy to be here and share what we know about the impacts of de-icing salt on the environment for water, especially. Oh, this was working. There we go. So I'll start with overall impacts of de-icing salt. You may have heard a bit of this before, so stop me if this is too much of a review. But typically when we're talking about de-icing salts, we're talking about things that are applied to road, sidewalks, or sidewalks, parking lots. And usually we're talking about sodium chloride. It's the same compound that is on the table next to the pepper. And when road salt or de-icing salt is applied, it does its job usually of lowering the freezing temperature of water so that you can increase the traction on a road or impervious surface or hard surface to increase the traction and provide greater public safety for people trying to travel on those surfaces. The other side of this is that after de-icing salt is applied and does its job for public safety, it breaks down, dissolves in liquid water and breaks into the two parts, sodium and chloride. And those can have impacts on our environment and on human health in some cases. Most of what I'll be talking about today is the chloride part of that story. And we have really good data on this in our region, in the Lake Champlain Basin, especially dating back to the early 1990s. I want to say that this is not a problem that is specific to our region or our state or the Lake Champlain watershed. It is a common problem worldwide in all developed areas that use de-icing salts, which is most of them. There are widespread impacts of salinization or increased salinity due to de-icing salts throughout the world. So this is not a unique problem to the Northeast US or to Vermont, but it is something that has been documented here, and I'll show you the data we have to support that. Elevated saltiness or salinity has adverse effects. It adversely affects all forms of life in an ecosystem. So this includes algae, zooplankton, macroinvertebrates, all sorts of critters and amphibians and fish. And it impairs their growth and reduces reproduction rates. And it can exert selective pressures on salt-tolerant species. In some cases, those may be invasive species that are more salt-tolerant. So it harms our native biota. And it can also reduce biodiversity in our ecosystem. So it has negative impacts on our ecosystem. There are also physical impacts on water quality. Because saltier water is more dense, it can impact the natural mixing patterns of lakes and water bodies. And I'll talk about that in a few minutes too. I was advised to show you some kind of conceptual diagrams and how salt moves through our environment. These have more information than you need to digest, but I'll try to highlight the most important parts for you. So here's one that I thought was useful. Road salts, after they're applied to a road, of course, they don't stay there forever. We see salt on the road, but it doesn't stay there throughout the summer, of course. So about half and half, 40-60 goes into the ground and eventually the groundwater or in our soils. And then the other 60% enters rivers and lakes and reservoirs, where it can have both different impacts on both of these types of systems. So in soils, it can increase acidity. It can increase the flushing of heavy metals and other contaminants. And as I said, I'll go over some more for the water side of this impacts in a moment. Here's another diagram, which I shared this this presentation with Annika, so this will be available to you all to review in more detail if you'd like. But I'm going to highlight this part of the diagram on the right, showing that increased salinity or more road salt impacts can decrease macrophyte biomass. That's just aquatic plant. Macrophyte's a fancy name for plants you can see. It can influence their ability to take up nutrients and grow, and it also impacts the natural ecosystem functions of our systems like wetlands. It can decrease the biofiltration systems that exist in those systems, and as I said, it can reduce biodiversity of different types of biological communities. Last one of these fancy diagrams here, just showing how saltier water is more dense and it kind of sinks to this red region down here below at the bottom of a lake. This is representing a lake here, and that can lead to oxygen depletion in the hypolimnion, which is the lowest part of a lake or a water body that is kind of broken up into different layers. And that can lead to the release of nutrients, which can drive things like cyanobacteria growth and all sorts of water quality issues that we are trying to work to prevent. So this is just another pressure on our systems due to de-icing salt application. And here I have a nice simple one to close the kind of conceptual diagram part of my talk. Too much salt is bad for aquatic life and drinking. That sums it up there for you. So all of these diagrams were taken from other work and just shown to you here as a resource, and happy to answer any more questions on that. But now I'll move into the next part here, which is really focused on the data we have for Lake Champlain and our tributaries. And this is coming primarily from the Lake Champlain Long-Term Monitoring Program. This is a flagship program of the Lake Champlain Basin Program. Since its founding in the early 1990s, it's targeted toward determining how the lake's water quality can currently be categorized and how it's changing over time since the beginning of monitoring. And I'll be showing results from a research paper that is nearing completion on multi-decadal over about 35 years of monitoring, showing salinization and the impacts of road de-icing salt in our watershed. So just some background on the data collection. Luckily, the folks who kind of formed and designed this program started monitoring for chloride from the beginning. That's at 15 lake sites and 18 tributary sites, plus or minus, depending on the time frame you're talking about, resulting in over 8,000 samples of chloride in our tributaries. And this is representing the mouths and close to the mouths of the rivers as they enter Lake Champlain. So kind of that downstream view of our tributaries to the lake, and then 15 lake sites, which results in over 7,000 samples that we could use for this study. So a lot of data. And I also will just really quickly, I'm not going to go over all the scientific methods for you all, but just to say that we have all these samples that are mostly collected during the warm months, but then we're combining it with stream flow that's monitored by the U.S. Geological Survey. And I develop a model to then predict how much chloride is in the water and going into the lake on any given day, going all the way back to 1991. And then from that, I'm going to talk more about this in a moment. From that, we can estimate not just how much is in the water for a creature or a fish swimming by, and how much that might impact them on a daily basis, but also the amount of chloride going into the lake on any given year. So I'll dive into that more in more detail in a moment. So just to introduce a term here that's probably going to be familiar, but just to define it for you, concentration of something like chloride is the amount measured in a unit volume of water. So in this case, I'm going to be talking about milligrams of chloride per liter. And this is really what's important for if you're a frog or if you're a fish and you have your 1 cubic meter of water that you're kind of living in. This is the number that's important for you, and that may or may not impact your fitness or ability to reproduce. A frog on a given day doesn't really care about how much chloride went into the lake last year. They care about what's in the water on that day, right? So this is the amount in a given unit volume of water. And what we've seen from our data is that concentration trends have increased since 1990 in 15 out of 18 of our major tributaries that have great data. And the magnitude of that increase ranges from about 41 to 163% increase, more than a doubling in some of our tributaries. So this is really a widespread increase that we've seen across the board. And now I'm going to do something that maybe you've seen before, or maybe you haven't. I'm going to explain what this and I'm going to do this for several, and you can stop me if you don't like this method, but I'm going to explain what the graph is going to show and explain the units and the time frame, and then I'm going to remove this white rectangle and show you the data. And I hope this will be a better way to, so we're clear on what I'm showing here. This is for the Winooski River near the mouth as it enters Lake Champlain. And on the vertical axis here, we're showing the annual average chloride concentration in milligrams per liter, and you're seeing 20 at this point and 30 here. And then across the horizontal axis, we're seeing the time frame really in decades since 1990. I'm going to remove that kind of rectangle and show that for the Winooski River, our largest tributary to Lake Champlain, we have significant increases in chloride, annual mean chloride concentration. And you can see that it's, approaching or really more than doubling the annual average concentration since the early 1990s. Now, I know you all probably don't work with these numbers on a daily basis, so I want to provide some context for what these concentrations mean for our ecosystems. So on the left here, I have just some general benchmarks that how I think of these concentrations, and some of them are actual benchmarks determined by the Environmental Protection Agency. So again, in milligrams of chloride per liter, when we see something that's less than 10, we consider that like a natural background concentration with little to no impacts from human activities or development. When we see something above 20 milligrams per liter, it's almost certainly elevated and impacted by human activities. 35 milligrams per liter or greater, that's where we have seen documented impacts to biodiversity. So that's another kind of rough benchmark that we use. And then now getting into the more defined benchmarks. Actually, let me just pausing at 35 milligrams per liter. If you go back to the Winooski River, you can see that in the early 1990s, we were close to close to between that natural and elevated benchmark between 15 and 20 milligrams per liter. And then around the year 2000, we kind of passed that elevated mark. And this is what I would call an integrated signal, meaning that we're at the bottom of the near the bottom of the Winooski River watershed. If you go up into the watershed, you're going to have regions of forest and undeveloped land that has much lower concentrations. And you'll also, of course, have developed areas that have much higher concentration. So it's a mix of all those areas, and it's an annual average. So even for the Winooski River, any given day may be much higher or much lower, depending on what's going on with the weather and the watershed management as folks are using de-icing salts in our watershed. And as you can see, the annual average is now, nearing what we see for documented impacts to biodiversity. Again, in our largest tributary, this is higher or lower in other tributaries as well. So the next are the EPA thresholds. 230 milligrams per liter is the chronic threshold for aquatic toxicity. This is really developed for fish, kind of higher in the trophic status. We know that things lower in the food chain have impacts at much lower concentrations, but for fish, we use 230 for the chronic threshold, which is it cannot exceed that for, I think it's 96 hours, 4 days. 250 milligrams per liter, that's where EPA has a secondary drinking water standard, and this is for taste. So EPA thinks that it's not ideal to have a concentration over this because the water will have a salty taste. It's different than our primary standards that are more for human health concerns. And then the last one on the list here is 860 milligrams per liter. This is the acute threshold for aquatic toxicity. It should not be exceeded for more than an hour, I think it is. So you can see for the annual average of the Winooski River, we're an order of magnitude below those EPA thresholds, but we are at the point where we're concerned about impacts to biodiversity and our more sensitive species. And again, I'm going to get into, I think it's next actually. Yes. So this is an example of an area within the Winooski River watershed that has more pronounced impacts because of the land use. Have you all, I can't see you very well. Have you heard about Sunnyside Brook and the TMDL?
We've heard a little, but we look forward to you telling us more. But can I
Okay.
just ask, I think I have a question on the previous slide.
Absolutely. Let me go back. Yep.
What is your thought on why concentrations declined between 2005 and to 2010 on the
Yep. You know,
Winooski?
I almost talked about it, and then I knew someone was going to ask that great question. So thank you for asking that. So it's an interesting story because there was a important paper that was released analyzing the same data, but it was released in 2012, and it was a kind of a success story that chloride concentrations were increasing, and then they started decreasing again. So this is a success, and you know, they presumed that it would continue to decrease. In that paper, they had really good data from VTrans on road salt application. It was only one source. Of course, there's many different sources of de-icing salt and folks who are using it, but that data from VTrans closely matched that, where it was increasing around the same time frame and then decreasing. I haven't been able to access that data. Mostly what I've done is look at the environmental result or the impacts. And actually, I'm going to talk about at the end where we have some funded studies that will look more closely at the actual usage data. So we're going to be able to learn more about whether the usage data that we have tracks this trend or not. But my hypothesis is that it is very closely related to how much road salt is applied. There is a bit of a lag effect too. So, you know, what you're seeing in any given year is not necessarily what's being applied that year. It might be from the previous years. We're going to talk about that in a minute if we have time. But this trend, and you're going to see this trend of first decade increase, second decade increasing, third decade increasing very sharply. That is reflected across nearly all of our tributaries, watershed wide, and in the lake itself. So, and it's very likely related to how road salt, de-icing salt has been applied in our watershed. And we're hoping to dig into that more with our research. But yeah, most of what I'm showing is what we're observing. We don't have great data right now on the why. We have the what's going on, but we're still working on the why it happened. And as you can imagine, it is difficult to pull in all these different sources of information over the decades of who was throwing salt on the landscape and when. So, but thanks for that question. Did that,
Sure.
Go ahead.
I mean, I guess I think there's more to the story and you're looking into it, is what I'm hearing.
I think so. Yes, exactly. Yeah. What we have, what I'm able to show with the data is what we've observed in the water quality. And there's more out there that we can learn, and we're working on it. Right.
And we have another question from Representative Sackwitz.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. This is great. So the 35 milligrams of chloride per liter level that where you show documented impacts, I'm suspecting that, you know, those are places where the signal is strong enough to really get a pretty clear, you know, correlation between those levels and the impacts. But that's just that where we have the data. So I guess my question is, do you think it's likely that impacts are happening at lower concentrations than that, and that we just haven't had the data or the tools yet to see those signals come clearly in the data?
I think it's definitely very possible that, you know, there's a body of work that a lot of researchers are working on this issue. That 35 milligrams per liter is specifically for biodiversity. So where there's a decrease in species richness and population dynamics. And these are studies that are looking at more impacted versus reference watersheds nearby that do not have development or de-icing salt application. And I think it's especially for sensitive species and native species, it's entirely plausible and likely has been documented. I'm not, you know, haven't scoured the research for every single example. I pulled out kind of this is a rough benchmark for where we're pretty certain that there is impacts, but I'm sure that for more sensitive species, that lower concentrations would be impactful as well. Yes.
Representative North.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah. Thank you for this presentation. Very interesting. Just a question about the units that and I appreciate your explanation of the milligrams of chloride per liter. How does that units relate to units that like we're used to seeing on our saline solution that we put in our eyes and, which is usually in terms of a percentage. So how do these numbers, milligrams per liter relate to percentage?
Interesting. I'm not sure I can give you a percentage, but I can actually when I presented to the Senate Committee on the Natural Environment, and they asked me how it relates to ocean water, and I have that number for this presentation. Ocean water is about in the tens of thousands of milligrams chloride per liter, so about 19,000 milligrams per liter. That gives you an idea. I mean, fresh water has much less chloride in it than seawater. I don't know how it compares to the saline in your eye. Sorry about that.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I guess one of the follow-on question then is we need to be, I guess, a little careful using the term toxin relative to sodium chloride. I mean, we put it in our eyes. It's a necessary part of life. Salt. It's a biological necessity. So calling it a toxin, and like you said, in the ocean, it's way more concentrated than this, and obviously there's lots of things in the ocean. So
Right.
I
don't think I've used the word toxin. I don't think I'd use the word toxin. Toxin actually refers to a different something that's created by an organism. EPA so toxicity is something that the EPA defines, very carefully, and I think the only time I've used the word toxicity is referring to the EPA threshold that they define.
For specific species or specific activities, biological activities, right?
So the EPA defines their chronic threshold for aquatic toxicity, where they have determined that this level of chloride, 230 milligrams per liter, should not be exceeded for more than 4 days in freshwater systems. And then 860 milligrams per liter of chloride should not be exceeded for more than 1 hour, I believe it is. I don't think if I did say it was toxic in any other context, I did not mean to. But
it's
like
listed on the chart.
Sorry?
Toxicity. The word toxicity is right on the chart. That's what I'm looking at.
For over 230.
It's used in reference to these EPA benchmarks. I'm saying I don't think I've used it in another context.
Okay, and that must relate to certain species or certain biological processes, not just in general, it's toxic. That's why
It is.
How does it relate to how much the saline solution I use in my eye? Am I putting something toxic in my eye or
It's related to the aquatic system, a freshwater ecosystem.
Freshwater ecosystem. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. If you dropped 230 milligrams of chloride, that concentration of water on your body, you would not be harmed. It's specifically relating to the freshwater aquatic system. Right.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks. All right. Any other questions, or should I continue?
Please go on.
Okay, great. All right. Now I want to cover, we were talking about Sunnyside Brook here, which is in the Winooski River watershed. And this is much more impacted by chloride. You can see we were talking about with the main stem Winooski River, we were talking about tens of milligrams per liter. Now we're talking about hundreds of milligrams of chloride per liter. And instead of talking about decades from 1990, we're talking about really over the course of about a year, a bit more than a year. And I'm going to pull away this rectangle here so you can see the chart. And I've drawn on, this is adapted from the total maximum daily load work that the Vermont DEC has developed. So this chart is from that report. And I've added on these lines roughly 230 milligrams per liter for the EPA chronic level for aquatic life toxicity, and 860 milligrams per liter chloride for acute toxicity. And you can see that for nearly that entire monitoring period, Sunnyside Brook exceeded the chronic level benchmark and at times also exceeded the acute level benchmark. And this is another chart from the Vermont DEC work on the TMDL, just showing the same thing, but in a table where the chronic exceedances were about 100% of the time, and the acute exceedances were much less, but more prevalent in the warm months. And that may be surprising because, of course, we use de-icing salts to improve public safety in the winter months. But I talked a little bit about how it goes into the groundwater and elevates groundwater concentrations. And during the summertime, we generally have much lower flows. We call it base flow. And that base flow is fed by our groundwater that is elevated in chloride from de-icing salt application in the winter. So our concentrations of chloride are usually actually higher in the summer, even though it's being applied in the winter. So you can see that acute threshold was exceeded less frequently in December and January. It was more prevalent in February. Throughout the spring, when snow is melting, that snow melt and even rainstorms will lower the concentration, dilute the water with less salty sources. And then in the summer, when it's base flow, that concentration, that's when the impacts to biota may be greatest because it's being fed by base flow. And that's also, of course, when temperature impacts and environmental degradation due to removing shade from streams can have temperature impacts on our species as well. So that is another factor kind of racking up on our sensitive species.
Can we pause here for a couple of
Yes.
questions?
Sure.
I'm curious about impacts to human health and like where does it start to affect people with high blood pressure?
So
Do you know?
I shouldn't really speak to human health. I'm not a medical doctor. I will say that the concerns with human health are more related to the sodium part of this equation. So I've been talking about water quality impacts to the environment and aquatic biota. That's mostly a concern for the chloride. The chloride concentration is the greatest concern there. For drinking water, I'm going to go back to my list here. The drinking water secondary standard is at 250 milligrams per liter. We are nowhere near that for Lake Champlain as a water source for drinking water. I will also say, and I'm not as closely familiar with the research, but I do know that especially in the Adirondacks, there has been impacted drinking water impacts or documented drinking water impacts, especially for private wells where sodium levels have been increased. So if you're a person who should be limiting their sodium intake, the groundwater from the well can be a source of sodium that would contribute to your daily or weekly sodium intake. Beyond that, I shouldn't say specific impacts because I'm not an expert on that.
Thank you.
Okay.
Representative Tadlia has a question.
You mentioned groundwater levels. How many wells were samples taken from, and were they deep water wells? Were they spring wells? Do you have that kind of information?
Yeah, as I said, that research has mostly taken place in the Adirondacks by the Adirondack Watershed Institute. Dan Kelting is the researcher, and he's the president of Paul Smith's college. I'm not as closely familiar with that. I bet that Chris Stepanuk, who's speaking next, will, or I'm guessing she may be more familiar with that research.
One thing I can just pop in to say is that one of the handouts that I sent to Annika is a compilation of all of the Lake Champlain Basin research on road salt. And so that there's a link and a listing of the paper that Matt just talked about that Dan Kelting put together. So you have access to that.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I think they had some voluntary folks who were submitting water from their wells voluntarily and looked at it that way, but I can't say what number of wells. I think that was your question, but it would be in that paper.
Right.
Okay, should I keep moving here?
Yes.
All right, thank you. All right, so we were talking about concentration during that portion. Now I'm going to introduce a new term called load. This is the total amount of chloride delivered to a water body in a period of time. So here I'm going to be talking about metric tons of chloride per year. A metric ton is 1,000 kilograms. It's about the size of an African black rhinoceros. So think, it's actually similar to a normal ton, which is a few thousand pounds. And here, the trend is very similar to concentration, where we've seen chloride loads increase since 1990 in 15 out of 18 of our tributaries. That increase has been minor in some, and it's been up more than a doubling in others, up to 127% increase. Again, in the amount of chloride going into Lake Champlain each year. Here, again, I'm going to show you the data from the Winooski River, our largest tributary to Lake Champlain. And I'm talking about 10 or 20, 30, 40, and 50,000 metric tons of chloride per year. And again, we're going back to 1990 through near present day here. And you're seeing a very similar shape of this curve and a general significant increase in chloride loading to Lake Champlain. And the takeaway here is that in the early 1990s, you know, we had something close to 20,000 metric tons of chloride per year entering the lakes, about 44 million pounds of chloride. And today we have more than double that entering Lake Champlain on a yearly basis. And that, of course, as you may guess, has an impact on Lake Champlain itself. So this is water quality data from Lake Champlain. We're looking back at concentration in milligrams per liter over the same time frame, 0, 5, 10, and 15 milligrams per liter. So lower than we were looking at the Winooski River. And you'll see an increase where regions of Lake Champlain have seen increases of 20 to 54% since 1992. And you can see kind of a shadow of that trend that we saw in our tributaries as well. So we're seeing a real link between what's going on in the watershed, what's coming down our rivers, and then what's reflected in lake water quality for chloride and salinity. Also note that the concentrations are lower here. So it's likely that Lake Champlain before the early 90s was probably below 10 milligrams per liter as a background concentration. And the early 90s, it was just above 10 milligrams per liter. And now we're above 15 milligrams per liter. This point here is actually 2023. And it was likely the reduction was likely a impact of the flooding of 2023, because as you recall from earlier, rainstorms and high flows actually have a dilution effect on chloride. So there's more rainfall and lower salinity water that enter the lake, and that's why the concentration may have been lower in 2023. Lower than the previous year. All right, I'm wrapping up here. I'll just go over some of the research that we're funding on this issue. Sorry, was there a comment?
No.
Okay, thank you. I mentioned the research article that is nearing completion. We are funding work in Mirror Lake, New York, which is next to Lake Placid, to document chloride impacts there and actually improvements in chloride loading due to some stormwater improvements in the town of Lake Placid. I mentioned this study where we're looking at long-term trends to inform BMP implementation and try to look at where sources of chloride use can be determined to help us to understand what has happened over the decades and what we can do in the future to reduce chloride loading. We have research on the future of road salt use using downscaled climate models. One thing I haven't mentioned is that counterintuitively, as the climate warms with climate change, we're projected to actually use more de-icing salt, because even though it's warmer, we're projected to be crossing that freeze-thaw line more frequently, which likely will result in increased de-icing salt use. So this research is going to help us understand what the future of that looks like and inform things, our best management practices, like more brine usage and application. The last one on the list here is a study supported by the Lake Champlain Basin Program to Middlebury College to look at where chloride is coming from on the landscape and what the impacts to macroinvertebrates may be in our streams. And I think that's all. I'll also say we have a lot of this is research, but we also have implementation and support to our watershed partners. I think Chris will likely talk about this too, where we're actually doing the work to reduce chloride or road salt application while maintaining a high level of service on our roads to maintain that safety and level of service we expect after a snowstorm. But we're all working to implement best practices that will reduce de-icing salt. And that's my last slide.
Great. Thank you so much for your presentation.
You're welcome.
All right. We have a question from Representative Bartholomew.
I'm looking around online and I'm getting myself confused because I'm seeing a distinction between chloride concentration and salinity. Like seawater somewhere about 19,000 chloride, but 35,000 salinity milligrams per liter. So why are we looking just at chloride? How do they relate?
Yeah, salinity can include other things that are dissolved in the water. And so when some oceanographers are looking at salinity in ocean water, it may include other salts and things that contribute to saltiness. I'm talking about chloride for two reasons. One is it's what is related to impacts for freshwater. It's the major concern to impacts to freshwater ecosystems. And two, we have really good data on chloride. We know that the main de-icing salt used in the country and in the Northeast and in our region is sodium chloride. There are other de-icers. Almost all of them also include chloride, but may have a different balance between the other side of it. So magnesium chloride is another example that can work at lower temperatures, but it's not as widely used. So it's a mix. For freshwater, chloride is the most important component. Salinity in general is a more broad term that can be applied to different situations.
Thank you. All right, next up, we have Christine Stepanek. Hope I got your name right. And if
Pretty
I
good.
didn't,
Yeah, I say Stepanek, but you were very close. Thanks for having me. I appreciate being able to be here with you remotely. I am, again, Chris Stepanek. I am an Extension Associate Professor at the Rubenstein School of Environment and Natural Resources at the University of Vermont. And I work with a program called Lake Champlain Sea Grant. So as an extension professor, my work is outward facing mostly from the university, and it's applied work with different groups. And the work that I've been doing over the past 10 years with communities has related to road salt. That has included commercial salt applicators and trying to understand the practices that they're using, as well as working with municipalities to understand their salting practices and to provide education to both of these groups. So the presentation that I wanted to share today summarizes a couple of different research projects that have happened. And I also have information, if you're interested, about best practices that can be implemented by either of those types of groups. And if that's helping to inform you about the bill, I'm happy to there is information throughout the presentation, but I have extra at the end if you would like that. So let me share my screen. So just a little history, because I don't know if you've heard about when salt was first begun being used to help minimize salt or ice formation on our roads. It was happening in New Hampshire back in the late 1930s, and it started being as a test. In 1941 was the first time it was used on roads, and the way that it was delivered to the roads, a couple of people would be in the back of the truck with their sacks of salt, and the driver would honk every half mile or mile so that they knew their application rates. At that time, there was about 5,000 tons of salt put on the roadways across the whole US, and that has increased over time. So by 1975, we were talking in million metric tons, and a metric ton is 2,200 pounds instead of 2,000 pounds. So there was about 7 million or 8 million metric tons by 1975. By 2015, we were looking at more like 23 million metric tons of salt. The graduate student, Holden Sparacino, determined that the road use in the US between 1975 and 2003 had increased about 6%, but salt use had gone up about 43%. To help you understand and to help me understand what is 23 million metric tons or 20 million metric tons, I did a calculation. And if we take our usual municipal salting trucks, they can hold a certain amount of salt. And to get to 20 million metric tons, you would fill a traffic jam of over 8,000 of these trucks. It would go from Burlington out to Seattle, back to Burlington, and back to Glacier National Park each year. So it's a lot of salt. And just a little bit of how does salt work to reduce the freezing point of water. There's a great video that I just took screenshots from here from the American Chemical Society. So if you start at the top left, you've got these little Mickey Mouse water molecules with your hydrogen and your oxygens. And normally in liquid water, they're floating around. When water forms ice, they form bonds between those molecules. And what we want to do with our salt is we toss the salt into the water. There has to be liquid water present for salt to do its job to lower the freezing point of water. Otherwise, what we want to happen won't happen, which is when salt enters water, it breaks apart into sodium. I'm at the top right here, sodium and chloride ions. And what happens is those, now I'm on the lower left, those sodium and chloride ions get in between the water molecules. And I like to reference it as like a hockey referee getting in between the hockey players. It doesn't let the water molecules bond together because the sodium or chloride is in between those water molecules. And that effectively lowers the freezing point of water. An important piece about this that is part of the education and that this bill would support to help our professionals who are using salt to understand is that sodium chloride has an effective temperature. Again, it needs liquid water to be present for the salt to break apart into the sodium and chloride. And so its effective minimum temperature to be used is pavement temperatures of 15 degrees Fahrenheit. So this is something that we try to educate about. If the pavement temperatures are colder than that, Matt mentioned something else has to be used. That can be something like magnesium or calcium chloride. And to his point, those are both chloride-based products as well. So there's still chloride that would get into the environment. The reason those work is they create heat when they enter the situation, they create heat to break apart into the calcium or the magnesium and the chloride. So that allows them to be used at a lower pavement temperature than sodium chloride. So now you have your science lesson. I'll talk about these two surveys that we conducted, one of which was with municipalities and counties in the Adirondacks and in Vermont, the other of which is with commercial salt applicators in the Lake Champlain Basin. So if you don't think, Matt and I think on the basin level a lot, but if you don't think on the basin level, basically the Lake Champlain watershed, the area that drains Lake Champlain, is as far south as Poultney, as far east as around Cabot, Vermont, goes up into Quebec, and then as far west as around Saranac Lake. I surveyed, again, counties, municipalities in both states, low percent of respondents. So my little salt is take this with a grain of salt, but get some characterization of what might be happening in these communities. So I asked them about what they're using to put on the surfaces that they are maintaining. And this varied by location, kind of location. So the kind of yellowish orange bars here are the New York municipalities. The bluish is the New York counties, and then the darker orange is the Vermont municipalities. So if you're thinking just about Vermont, what we know is that the Vermont are about a third of these communities are using a salt sand mixture. And I can tell you, I heard testimony yesterday, someone who was asking about how much salt is in the sand, and what they do is they actually mix a little bit in, and that varies depending on where you are. It was low as 5% salt up to I think it was 25% salt. So it's a range of that, and they put salt into the sand so that the sand doesn't freeze up on them and they can spread it more easily. So we see in I'll just speak to Vermont, about a third of communities are using a salt sand mixture. 3/4 of communities here are using sand. One thing about sand, you don't see it happening in much use in New York. The sand is used on dirt roads, and you would not use salt on dirt roads because it just forms it binds up and it would create a mess. That said, there is use of calcium chloride by communities that have dirt roads in the summer for dust control. So just a outside of winter use of a chloride-based product that you might want to keep in mind. So we see 3/4 of municipalities in Vermont using sand, we see 100% of communities using dry rock salt. So as Matt just said, we know that this is the top product that's being used by communities to help keep our roads safe. What we don't see is some of these other ways of going about it. So only 16% of our Vermont communities were pre-wetting the rock salt. And what that means is they can do this in a couple different ways, but the most common way to do it is to put a tank of a brine, a 23.3% solution of salt and water attach that to the truck, and then they run some tubing hoses right down to where the salt spins off the truck. It's called a spinner, and they pre-wet right before the salt goes onto the pavement. And what that does is it minimizes the amount of bounce off of the salt from that surface, and it helps it stay in place to do the job that we want it to do on the road, rather than bouncing off into vegetation, getting into groundwaters, running off into waterways. And it has helped communities that are using this to reduce their salt use by about 40%. The other option here is brine. Very few communities are using brine. This is, again, a salt water mixture. It's 23.3% salt. The reason for that concentration is that is the there's a the eutectic temperature. Again, that sodium chloride can't be used lower than 15 degrees Fahrenheit pavement temperatures, and so that gives the broadest opportunity of getting salt to work. If you make it more concentrated or less concentrated, you could actually cause slippery conditions. And there was a time in Vermont that there was some challenges that happened with use of brine, a liquid salt. So there's not a lot of buy-in to that by the communities, simply because of past challenges that happened with its use. And then again, low percents of communities using calcium chloride or magnesium chloride. This is more expensive, and the reason, and when it is used, it tends to be used saved for when it's colder, because it can be used at pavement temperatures colder than 15. On average, the communities that shared how much salt they used, there's about 957 tons of salt per community going out onto the roads in the Adirondacks and in Vermont each year. So there are best management practices that are able to be used, one of which I just talked about with the pre-wetting of the salt at the spinner. They can make the practices that the municipalities or the commercial salt applicators are using more efficient. It reduces salt use, and they can provide similar levels of service, and it doesn't sacrifice safety. So one study, just looking into literature, this is, again, my grad student Holden found a range of information across studies, but up to 73% lower sodium chloride salt usage when best management practices are used and when there's winter maintenance plans. So people making plans about what they're going to do when, talking to customers if they're commercial salt applicators, for instance, lower winter maintenance costs. And then the 7% lower rate of snow and ice related collisions, I would say that's about the same. So we're showing that there can be less salt used, same or similar levels of service to continue to protect the public. Back in the Lake Champlain Basin, we asked the municipalities and counties in New York what kinds of best practices they might be using, or I knew they were best practices. I'd ask them, do you use these suite of things? So looking at the far right column, that's our Vermont municipalities. So the top things that were used, even not only in Vermont, but New York and the counties as well, is adjusting the type or amount of product based on the conditions. So 90% of Vermont municipalities are doing that. They're thinking about, is it snowing? Is it freezing rain? Is it the temperature going up? What's happening? And they're going to change the amount of salt going out on the roads or other surfaces based on that. They cover their salt. 94% of communities are covering the salt. That's great. It's not going to rain and run off. They're using equipment that allows them to adjust rates to that point. 95% of communities are doing that. And they also are looking at the weather. They're being informed by NOAA, by National Weather Service, by local WCAX, other weather places where they can find out what's going on. And then in Vermont communities, we're seeing that some of the other new technologies or maybe things that might take more time are used less often. So you see 37 to, or I guess 16% up to 42% of Vermont communities are doing things such as using equipment that clears snow more effectively. And one example of that, there's new kinds of plows. They're called segmented plows. So rather than having one single plow blade, they have a blade that is in multiple pieces. And so that can adjust to road conditions and can better scrape the surface. We know if we can better scrape the surface, then you need less salt to be able to do the job we want it to do. So we only have 37% of communities. This survey was done in 2022, so it's a little bit dated. We know only, again, about a third of communities are using pre-wet salt to help it stick to the road better. We know only less than half are using a winter snow and ice management plan. Pavement temperatures to the point of knowing whether the pavement is too cold to put down sodium chloride, but also on the other end of the scale, if the temperature, say like today we had snow by my house, we know it's getting warmer. If one of the trucks was out and they had a road temperature sensor, they could tell, hey, the road is already at 35 degrees. I know it's getting warmer today. I'm not going to salt. It can be a difference of reducing their salt application in one run that can truly reduce salt use by half because of being informed by what is happening at the pavement by temperature. Anti-icing is a term that is talking about, rather than de-icing, so if ice is already formed, we want to get rid of it, anti-icing would be proactive application of salt or salt brine ahead of a storm. And what that does is it prevents the bond from forming between snow and ice and the surface, and it makes it easier for the plows to scrape the surface once snow does come down. And so that can help them get a cleaner surface and again, use less salt. And then pre-treating salt piles is used by few, and that basically just wetting the salt pile rather than wetting the salt at the spinner as it comes out. We also asked them about how they are measuring the amount of products that are going onto the surfaces. And so I'll focus on the darker orange, the Vermont municipalities. We know about 40% of the communities are estimating it based on how much they purchase at the beginning of the year or throughout the year and how much they have left at the end. I know some communities are also estimating it based on per storm event. So they know they filled the truck, they know they came back with about a third left. So they figure they know how many, how much the truck holds. And they say, okay, well, I probably used about this much. A best practice is to use tracking devices on the trucks. They can know precisely how much salt is going out at any given roadway, in any given storm. One community I know is using this best practice and helping to reduce use of salt by posting after each storm in the break room who used how much salt, having a goal set that the drivers know about, and then kind of letting them heckle each other if somebody has kind of gone crazy with their salt use. So trying to use that as a what we don't know, what we can't measure, and that comes up in a video we've made with a commercial salt applicator. There's also a simple method that what they can do each year is to do a calibration. This is something called a drop test. And it's not hard to do. It takes a couple minutes, and they just basically run their spinner. They measure how much salt comes out in a given minute, and then they can adjust their equipment so that they're aiming to get a certain number of pounds out per minute. If that is off, they can adjust the opening of the gate in the truck to minimize. And the other thing it allows them to do is to know at which setting in the truck how much salt is coming out. And that helps them to know how much they're putting out rather than just a kind of an on or an off. And then we know that about 40% of Vermont communities are not tracking their salt use at this time. So again, the drop test is pretty simple and quick. I have made videos with some of our communities to help educate other communities about this. And these are available on the Lake Champlain Sea Grant website. I also asked them about what were their motivations, what would be the motivations to reduce use of salt. The number one reason, and the colors here are, how much would this be a motivation? Would it be to a great extent? That's in the yellow, somewhat of a motivation. A little bit is in orange, and not at all is green. So from the top to the bottom, the number one motivation would be if they could reduce costs. That would be a motivation to reduce use of salt. We had about 50% of the communities answering this. This is just Vermont municipalities. Also protecting human health, very high on the list. Around 50% said this is a really important thing. We don't want to contaminate groundwater, for instance, if we keep using so much salt or our drinking water in Lake Champlain. So it makes sense for us to think around reducing the use of salt. They're also aware of environmental impacts. And I want to mention infrastructure impacts. So the University of Vermont has a salt reduction task force. And the reason that that came up was due to infrastructure on campus having much shorter lives than was anticipated and costing the university thousands, hundreds of thousands, if not more than that, in replacing steps, doorway entries, underground vaults that have literal stalactites of salt coming through from the surface, and doors. So they were motivated that way, but also trucks and bridges and things in our communities that are being impacted by the salt that we're putting out. So that's a motivation from the community perspective as well. And then also having recognition, people are like, well, that's not bad. Not as high of percent of interest there, but also it's not bad to be recognized. And I can tell you from talking with both the private contractors or the commercial salt applicators and the municipal is, they hear from everybody. They hear from their community leaders. They hear from the people who live in the community, good and bad, depending on what they do. I also asked about what would be the barriers to municipalities to reducing use of salt. And maybe unsurprisingly, the number one barrier would be concerns about liability. And I don't have it in this presentation, but I've begun a project in Inglesby Brook Watershed, which starts on the UVM campus and drains down through South Burlington and Burlington to Lake Champlain at Oakledge Park. And the businesses that I've spoken to, the number one thing that is hindering their ability to reduce salt is liability concerns. But also back at the municipality level, the cost of alternatives is high, or the fact that there really isn't an alternative that is, well, it's not affordable, but maybe not even, people don't even feel like there are alternatives that are really feasible for them to consider besides salt. So around 40%. So that's kind of a big barrier. Again, public opinion came up. Around 30% of people said that's a big deal. One that I haven't mentioned yet is salt makes the job easier. So this comes up with staffing and with the time of day that people get called out, because salt, if somebody was to put salt down, say at 11 o'clock at night because they know a storm's going to come in ahead, that might buy them an extra hour of sleep in the morning before they have to have somebody come in. So salt means maybe we need less staff, maybe we have extra time that we don't have to come in early. And then on the good front there, nobody is really concerned about losing budget allocation if they don't use all the salt that they brought in a certain year. So the most common things, asking them about, what would be useful to you to encourage salt reduction? They say funding to purchase updated equipment. 70% of the communities, this is across New York and Vermont now, said, that would be very helpful if we could actually get up to speed with some of these new technologies. People also talked about 2/3 talking about having a public education campaign to change people's expectations about what to expect in winter. And to my point a minute ago, having more staff to share the workload was recognized by over half of the communities. So key takeaways is there's not a lot of use of brine or pre-wetting salt, which we know can save up to about 40% of salt use. There's limited use of tracking of salt use, particularly in Vermont. There's limited measurement of pavement temperatures, which can inform salting that's going out. Limited use of new technologies, partially due to not having the funding to be able to do that. Limited calibration of equipment. All of these things, I think, are things that can be addressed with a training program like is being proposed, because they are the kinds of things that drivers would learn from one another. And I can also say one of the things I've heard in informal conversations with municipalities is talking about, is there opportunities to save funds by having shared procurement, maybe with the state or otherwise, where they could get a better deal on some of the new technologies, or cooperatives. And then there's an example from Peru, New York, where they have a brine cooperative to help people be able to have a place to go, kind of like a gas station to get their brine, rather than each community having to invest $100,000 in a brine machine, having to have a staff person run it. They're working to have a shop for the brine.
So I want to just take a pause here. I notice you're not halfway through your slides.
Oh, that's okay.
Concerned about time a little bit. So
Yep,
just
I have a bunch at the end that were the ones that were just kind of pictures of different best practices.
okay.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. All right. So there's a video that is, I will not show, that is of Hyde Park success story, if you would like to check that out later on. From the commercial applicators' perspective, we know up to 40% of salt is going onto parking lots, entries, driveways. We surveyed 232 companies. We got 70 respondents. This is back in 2017 and 18. So what I can tell you is that the primary place that these people are servicing is parking lots. We normalized what that is across. So it's about 24 lane miles per commercial applicator. And so overall, the commercial applicators, we estimate they're servicing about 5,000 lane miles, which is a little bit less than what the Vermont Agency of Transportation is servicing themselves. So just comparing state to private contractors or commercial salt applicators. We asked them about the types of materials they used. We know high percent, about 80% using a salt and sand mix, as I talked about before, about 75% using sand, about 40% using pure sodium chloride, and then a small percent using other kinds of blends that are proprietary. We asked them similarly about the different kinds of best practices. So these are the same or very similar to the ones I asked the municipalities. We know that almost everybody is using adjustable equipment, or equipment that allows for adjustable application rates. We know that they are avoiding pushing snow into waterways. We know that they are removing snow frequently. So they, again, removing snow, the better you can remove the snow, you can avoid ice buildup, and then you use less salt. We know that they're using forecasting. Over 80% are using forecasting to inform and adjust their surface treatments. 80% are covering their salt and sand piles. And again, similar to the municipalities, smaller percents are measuring pavement temperatures, treating surfaces ahead of storms, storing their salt on paved surfaces, or using the pre-wetting the salt or brines, where less than 40% are doing those kinds of practices. We know the commercial salt applicators have barriers to using best practices. Costs, again, is a big deal for them. The ability, because they have small staffs, time for about half of them. And then customer expectations came up again for them in terms of what are the drivers of why they're doing what they're doing. Customers want things a certain way, so they do it that way. I provided to you through Annika a handout that looks through different peer-reviewed literature that talks about the different best practices. Here I'm calling it sustainable practice types. Those are in that handout. And then this is where now every slide from here is basically just talking about those. So I can stop here. You have that handout if you want to talk about that. I'm happy to talk more about these other best practices, but I also was prepared to just stop right here and take questions.
Great, thank you so much for all this information. I have kind of a basic question, which is do we know that reducing the use of sodium chloride reduces the concentrations of chloride in our waters? I mean,
It's a great question. So I think you have New Hampshire Green Snow Pro folks coming in next week. And so that is a question that I know they are wondering about with their program. We know that if there's less, there will be different numbers in terms of the milligrams per liter, like Matt was talking about. But what that equates to is going to vary by every individual storm and every stream and every water body. So I can't tell you what the numbers look like differently.
okay, thank you. Representative North?
Yeah, just a chemistry question. I'm trying to remember back to my high school chemistry, and I have to admit I was pretty bad at it. But a salt, you've got, the two components, the positive ion and the negative ion. We've been really talking about chloride as the negative ion being the one that impacts the aquatic life. And I'm wondering, is there another way to make salt that doesn't use chlorine specifically for the negative ion? And would that produce the freezing temperature reduction we're looking for, and then also not cause the water quality issues that we're seeing?
Yeah, so you can use sugars. So one of the alternative things is other kinds of anything like that that's going to get in between the water molecules. So you could use molasses, cheese waste, beer waste. I'm trying to think, beet juice. All of those have been used and are, but then they have their own impacts. And the impact there is any of those sugars, when they run off into the water, basically all the microorganisms are like, woohoo, party, sugar in the stream. And then they feast on all that sugar that runs off, and then they die, and then they decompose, and then all the oxygen goes out of the water. So the biochemical oxygen demand gets walloped. There is a product of potassium acetate that is a consideration that does not have the same principles or like you say, of the chloride or of these sugars, but it's expensive. So that is an option, but it's limited use because it's pricey.
Can you say that product one more time? What acetate?
Potassium acetate.
Potassium acetate.
Mhm.
Representative Bartholomew.
I have two questions. One, you said that, if I understood correctly, for sodium chloride to work, you have to have liquid water.
Correct.
So at 15 degrees, you said it works down to 15. You don't have liquid water at 15.
Well, you do, like, on the micro scale, right? So there's like a water molecule here, a water molecule there. There just has to be like a tiny, tiny bit of it. So you are correct. It shouldn't be, but because they haven't all necessarily bonded together yet, there's still enough water molecules that are kind of falling into place that there's enough there to be able to do it. But it's the lowest effective temperature that at which salt can work. So there's not a lot going on there that would be available in liquid.
Okay, and my other question is, a couple of witnesses have mentioned using a chloride solution for dust control. Why would you do that? How does that work?
Well, it's the same reason you don't use it on the roads in the winter. It basically binds up, the soil will bind together as a result of the chloride mixing with it. So it holds the soil in place rather than letting it become dust.
Representative Tagliavia.
To John, your question. The calcium chloride, when it's applied, it comes out wet, but it also grabs the humidity in the air, and it basically keeps the road wet. So you don't get dust coming off when you drive over it. It actually puts a skin on the road.
Talking about dust.
For dust, correct.
Thank you so much for sharing your data and information with us today.
Sure thing. Happy to be here. Thanks.
All right. Okay, we have witnesses from ANR and VTrans with us right now waiting. And so I just want to do a check-in on time. How much time you both think you need to give us the information we need to get from you?
15 minutes. Sure, Sheldon.
All right.
We can adjust up or down. We're prepared to walk through at least sections of major sections of the proposed legislation, and we can talk about our concerns or our agreement, our recommendations for those different sections. We also had planned to pick up a few of the questions that we took away from the committee the other day. So
Sounds
that's or so, maybe 20.
And yeah, Craig DiGiambrino from V-Trans. We don't need that much time, given the testimony we just heard from Chris, which sort of goes through our suite of BNPs that we use. But we have Vermont Water Roads with us today, not on the agenda, but we're available for answering questions, maybe offering an opinion on 86, 29 for your use. We're here for your use.
Right, thank you. So it sounds like we will have enough time. And then I'm gonna ask you all for guidance. My sense is it might make sense to hear from V-Trans first, since you have, since A&R has specific comments on the language before us.
To jump in and give you a few minutes of feedback on the bill and
Sure.
questions for us. We're happy to answer those. And like I said, we have Vermont Local Roads here. I'll avoid sharing my screen because I agree with me, but so thank you for having us, Madam Chair, Representatives. Craig DiGiambrino again with V-Trans. I'm with the Maintenance Division, and we're the folks with the orange trucks. But we're also an environmental group that I supervise and manage that manages all of our stormwater compliance programs, including the TMDLs, including operational stormwater permitting, including the multi-sector general permit, which is airports and gravel pits. And so we're an all-in sort of group addressing our TMDL compliance and stormwater compliance programs, just as a way of introduction. I'd like to echo A&R's earlier testimony that we collaborate on a lot of fronts. This is one of the fronts that we intend to collaborate on. We have been collaborating on. We've got a long history of collaboration on our salt usage and reducing and optimizing our usage of chlorides. Suite of practices, as I mentioned, Chris presented. The ones that were the high flyers, using equipment to gauge, using using the variety of tools she presented, and I won't go through them again, but we're using all of those. We track our salt usage. The one thing that I would offer for your consideration that she did not mention is the public outreach component, changing behavior component. We use variable message boards. You've probably seen them on the road. It says, slow down. We have corridor priorities in our plan that the public can see that says the interstates are going to get plowed first, secondaries maybe second, and then there's a couple other priorities corridors below those. But it sets an expectation that if you're going to go out on the road, you may be driving on snow. So I think that's an important component of any practice that moves forward. So regarding 86 and 29, they're substantially different, as you mentioned yesterday and heard from O'Grady's testimony. We support moving forward with a version of the bill that more mirrors 29. There's a lot of work that was done on that bill. We did a lot of testimony in natural resource and energy. I know A&R is here today with some amendments. I've looked at those amendments online, and we can back what they're proposing. The other thing that we want to offer is that a bill without the carrot, the limited liability protections really probably doesn't mean a lot. And maybe other ways to get at reducing chloride usage or salt application if that's not going to be in the bill. So we would advocate for that to be in the bill. I did offer a chloride reduction plan, snow and ice control plan. You have that. I did also offer some guidance from the Clear Roads Research Program. It's a multi-state organization, member organization. They do a lot of research. Probably quite equivalent to what Chris presented on, but it's DOT specific, roadway specific. May not be as transferable to, as well as our suite of BNPs, to the commercial entities the bill may be focusing on, if that's the direction the committee takes it. So that's what I had to offer. I'm happy to answer questions. I know there were some questions over the past couple of days of testimony. And again, we have Vermont Local Roads here to offer testimony if you have interest in that as well.
Sure, thank you for that. I guess I'm curious how you all got to being interested in the salt reduction program.
Well, TMDL compliance, affordability, the reasons that Chris mentioned are pretty relevant to the state transportation needs to save money, provide for safe travel, protect water quality. I mean, we have a safe roads and safe speeds policy. We've had that in place since 1980, early 80s. And that's part of our outreach is don't expect to have bare roads. So we have the obligation under TS4 to comply with chloride impairments. The Sunnyside Brook is one. There are other non-TMDL impaired watersheds for chloride, which our TS4 dictates that we need to manage similarly in those watersheds. So we developed a plan that will apply statewide.
How much do you think you're saving Vermonters with using less sodium chloride?
Financially speaking, that's hard to pinpoint. I can offer that in terms of tonnage that we use on a low year, 58,000 tons. On a high year, 209-ish tons across the state. And we tried to compare that with winter severity, for example. But that winter severity doesn't include those wet precipitation events. So it's kind of hard to predict if we're saving the taxpayers money. It all depends on the storm, right? And we're going to see some ice this weekend, potentially. So, on the weekend, we thought we may not be out. We probably will be out putting down some material. We have stopped using sand for the most part. We use it on hills or exit ramps, or our sand usage has dropped dramatically. I've got some numbers that I can share with you there too. 2002, we were using around 113,000 tons of sand. And in 2024, we used 1,700 tons.
2004?
2024, sorry.
24.
Yep.
1,700.
So we moved away from using sand because of the sediment impairments and phosphorus and it not really being as useful a product as salt.
Curious what your definition of hills is.
Yeah, good question.
Pretty steep, I'm guessing.
I don't think we have a definition of hills. I think about, what is it, truck route down in southern Vermont. So up and over the gap, I forget the name of the song, but excuse me. Yeah. Yeah, it really depends on the route and the type of traffic, the volume of traffic. We may wait till the next day to get out there and manage your snow and ice based on what our corridor prior dictates.
And back to how much we might be saving if we could avoid a chloride TMDL. We are presumably going to be saving some dollars for Vermont taxpayers.
Yes, I would hope so. We've already spent a significant amount of money on the equipment that was mentioned in Chris's presentation, monitoring equipment, in-cab computers, pavement temperature sensors on our trucks, so that you can make automatic adjustments while you're moving from one microclimate to another in the state on the same route. We have data we submitted to A&R upon request on our usage. So I think we're as much of a leader as we are in that realm. I think if you're focusing on commercial applicators, what you heard from Chris is probably going to be more applicable, or what you might hear from New Hampshire on how they manage their commercial applicators.
Yeah. And with all that great investment in technology, are you able to share information with towns?
We do. Yep. We have a local roads program, offers educational opportunities for municipalities. And the BMP is available for them to have and draw from.
I'm even thinking about your application decisions in a given town or region. Your truck is doing cool stuff and telling your operator what to do. Is there a way to real time that to an operator in a town and say like, hey, the surface is less than 15 degrees, or I don't know. Maybe that's an easy one for towns to get themselves, but just a thought.
Yeah, good question. I don't have a direct answer for that. To communicating, receiving communication from a town or vice versa on the information we're gathering and providing that to municipality.
Yeah. Might be happening anyway, because the road crews are, thinking like in Middlebury, we have a V-Trans shed. It's co-located. I hope we still have one. We might have gone to Rutland last year.
Right. Well, we do have a 511 system that you're probably aware of, road condition, hazardous conditions, road closures, those types of, that data is available. We don't have cameras or remote sensing equipment on municipal roads, but they may be able to get some intel from that if it's in close proximity to our information.
Representative Tagliavia.
You mentioned interstates, and those would be the first or the ones that you concentrating on keeping them clear. With respect to getting federal dollars for interstates and maybe even some state highways, is there a requirement for keeping the roads safe, for whatever that means, and clear, that if you reduce the salt too much, you're going to put federal dollars at risk?
Good question. And I'm not aware of that being the case. I can dig into that a bit more and respond if you'd like.
You mentioned sand versus salt. We cut back on sand usage. Did your salt usage go up exponentially after you cut back on your sand?
Another good question. We have that mapped out. It's pretty flatline, to be honest. Even if you take out the high and the low point as a variable, it's flatline.
More, if I may. You mentioned the electronic equipment. I drive down 110 through Washington a lot. There's big elevation change. And at the lowest part of the elevation, where it's very near to the creek, it gets cold and it gets icy, it gets black ice a lot. Did I hear you correctly that equipment is adjusting as it's sensing ground pavement temperature as the driver is driving down the road?
It's informing the driver to make an adjustment
Okay.
in that moment.
Representative Laver.
Thank you, Chair. My district is in the Northeast Kingdom. And because of 2 mild past winters, budgeting was insufficient for this last winter. So some of the towns ran out of salt. Is there any mechanism for quality studies on the salt that comes in? Some of the salt that was trucked in obviously was exposed to water somewhere, either environmental or pre-wetted. You had to use front end loaders to smash it up so they can load it into the trucks. That's time consuming, it's costly, and doesn't add to uniformity of spreading. And these weren't small trucks that are trucking this. They were 22 wheelers. So I guess my question is I'm assuming that they're purchasing from a state approved vendors.
I don't know if they're state approved vendors. I can tell you what V-Trans does in terms of quality assurance. We won't take a load unless we test it. And that's for sand particles that might, gum up our systems. We certainly don't want chunks running through spreader and clogging the truck, and then you wind up with a pile on the ground, or you have to go back to the shop and rework a pile. Not quite sure I have a full answer for you because I'm not aware of what's happening in municipal.
Well, the commercial spreaders got a hold of me because it froze in the back of their trucks. And then when they activate the spreader, they were blowing drivetrain on the spreader. Shafts and belts. It's pretty expensive.
So that would be, you know, quality assurance for they purchase from the vendor and or maintaining coverage on their piles, which is part of the bill at some point.
That's the reason for my question. I'm asking if there is a source that has a known quality that is approved. Say the state ran out of salt by thousands of tons a year.
Yep, train comes in from New York and we test it and yep, we make sure that it's available, it meets our
All
specifications.
came from New York
Right.
prior to the tariffs.
Yep.
So they have to cross Canada to get to us out the north end.
See what happens, right?
But right,
But yeah, quality assurance it should be part of the plan. So you're not inefficiently using material or losing material or wasting money.
Give the representative from local roads just a moment to introduce himself and give us a little overview of how you fit into this conversation.
Todd Eaton, branch manager for the Vermont Local Roads Program. Vermont Local Roads provides training and technical assistance to municipalities at no cost, purely a voluntary program. It's a program that's been in existence since 1984, and we're well known, and I believe the services that we provide are well appreciated. As far as how it fits specifically to this, we do offer winter maintenance training. It is again voluntary. As far as our attendance, if currently we have offered winter maintenance training about 4 to 8 times a year. With we cap it at about 20 participants per session. Those participants could be, I mean, there may be 3 to 4, maybe, you know, for instance, from one specific municipality, you know, making up that 20 participant cap. The content of the training that we provide follows all of those BMPs, uses a lot of the data that we could share as far as from V-Trans. Well, even actually, in addition to that, I'll just add that we have actually offered weather prediction training. We've brought in NOAA from Burlington to travel around and offer training to teach them how to use those tools so that they can do more localized prediction and as far as to when to send out their trucks for because obviously there's an overtime cost of calling your crew in to do winter maintenance. And I don't know what else I can add just off the top of my head.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. We do need to move on. I know there's 2 other people with questions briefly. We have to make sure we have time for ANR. Representative Morris.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So one who travels from the southern eastern side of Vermont up to Montpelier on the interstates and having worked in emergency services for 50 years. I am very impressed with what V-Trans has done on the roads and I for one appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yeah, echo that as well. It's pretty impressive. Someone who has to get over Middlebury Gap to get here is really well done, well cared for. Representative Tagliavia.
Can you tell me the difference in price between, say, the average 10-wheeler, brand new 10-wheeler that comes with hydraulic adjustment on the spinner, hydraulic adjustment on the chain versus the electronic equipment that one of your 10-wheelers has for this salt application?
Sorry, I can't. If I
Right.
like that information, I could try to dig it out.
We find that. Yeah. All right. Thanks again for joining us.
Welcome. Thank you for having me.
Morning, Chair Sheldon. Ready? We're back.
We're grateful.
Again, Pete Laflamme, Director of the Watershed Management Division at the Vermont DEC, and again, here today with Bethany Sargent, the Deputy Director of the Watershed Management Division. And we wanted to do a couple of things this morning. We wanted to talk about the answer some of the questions that we received the other day that we did not answer in real time, provide you a little bit more monitoring data. Matt Vaughn did a nice job showing a lot of monitoring data on Lake Champlain and its tributaries, which again is the western half of the state. We received some questions about the Northeast Kingdom and about other lakes and water bodies, as well as impaired waters in the state. And Bethany is going to do a short presentation to answer some of those questions. We also wanted to walk through not a line by line version, but just in general, the major sections of the bill as it's constructed, H86, S29. As our colleagues from V-Trans said, we've done a lot of testimony over on the Senate side. That bill has evolved over time, so it's different. So it's hard to know which bill to work from. We have a marked up version of S29, which again, the concepts are very similar. The base concepts are very similar to the bill H86. So I think that information will translate. Again, ANR, the administration supports the core concept of this bill, that optimizing, putting in place voluntary certification for commercial applicators, working with our colleagues in V-Trans and the local roads program in terms of providing that training to municipal applicators. And then we agree with the relationship that DG spoke of a few minutes ago. We have a very good relationship with V-Trans, and they've done a lot of great work over the years in terms of implementing technologies to optimize the use of salt. I think just to summarize where we're at right now and what you've heard in various presentations, application of sodium chloride de-icing salts is really the only game in town in terms of at this time, in terms of providing de-icing, necessary de-icing in the winter, that we feel obviously that that's necessary. Maintaining safe surfaces in the winter is extremely important, and optimizing through the use of BMPs, as Chris Stepanek had a great presentation on those sorts of BMPs, teaching that through the local roads program, and then also standing up a commercial applicator certification program in exchange for that limited liability provision. I think it's really important to maintain that carrot to encourage and to entice commercial applicators to take that training, optimize the use of salt, and reduce the use of salt. We talked about the fact that this is a step, an important and significant step in the right direction, but given the magnitude of salt, given that's applied in the state, through V-Trans or in total, and given the variability in winters, given the variability of conditions during a given winter, it's an intuitive step in the right direction. It's not, we cannot quantify it. We know that if we put less salt on, we're going to result in lower concentrations over time in the receiving waters. But there's not a firm one-to-one relationship that we can establish there. We support fully the concept of optimizing salt use and therefore reducing the excess and unnecessary application of salt. We've seen in several presentations, and we spoke about it the other day, the deleterious effects that excess salt has on aquatic organisms. Just to pick up quickly on two areas that Matt Vaughn spoke of this morning, the 230 milligrams per liter of chronic concentration and the 860 of acute concentration, many feel are way too high. You saw the 35 as a threshold point where effects are seen on certain biodiversity indices. EPA, the way we adopt our water quality standards in Vermont, and our standards are currently the national standards, which is the 230 and 860. EPA nationally, the Office of Science and Technology, works hard to develop new criteria. It takes them years to do that. They're currently working on evaluating chloride criteria. Those numbers are too high. 230 and 860 are too high, and I would imagine in another year or two, EPA will come out with chloride concentrations that are lower than that. They'll be more protective of aquatic organisms, but they'll also increase the number of waters in Vermont that are impaired, and other states as well. States are beholden to adopt the criteria that EPA, so-called 303A criteria that EPA promulgate at the national level. And then finally, that was a great question, Representative North, about percent of saline that you put in your eye drops compared to milligrams per liter of salt in waters. Just a quick note on that. Milligrams per liter are equivalent to parts per million. So, and percent are parts per 100. So 10 to the second, 10 to the sixth, the difference of 10 to the fourth. So 10,000 times would be the multiplier to go back and forth between milligrams per liter and percent. It was a great question. I understood exactly what you were asking. And so now Bethany has a presentation where we'll walk through some of the other questions that we received the other day, both in terms of Northeast Kingdom lakes and impaired waters in Vermont, and waters where we're currently working on developing TMDLs, very similar to the Sunnyside Brook TMDL. You saw the data that was shown as to how high those concentrations are in Sunnyside Brook. And as I testified the other day, areas with a lot of impervious surface and a relatively small drainage area, relatively small brook, we're going to see those incredibly high concentrations. So, Bethany.
Thanks. So again, my name is Bethany Sargent. I'm the Deputy Director in the Watershed Management Division. And I wanted to just follow up on some questions that I heard over the last couple of days, both from our initial testimony on Tuesday, as well as from Ledge Counsel in response to his presentation yesterday. So I'll try to go quickly through these, knowing that we're limited on time, but wanted to share some of the data that our monitoring and assessment staff have collected on chloride in our lakes and streams. We have a lot of data. We have done pretty comprehensive monitoring. So we started monitoring total chloride in 2006. Just in terms of reference, so 2 milligrams per liter is essentially the reporting limit or detection limit. And so those lakes that are in very heavily forested watersheds, very low impervious surface, are going to have chloride concentrations slightly above or near that detection limit. As Pete mentioned, that the higher the road density in the watershed, the greater the concentration of chloride. And you can see this in the graph. It has watershed paved road density versus lake chloride. So you can see there's a trend there. Bit of a delay. So as I mentioned, we have a lot of data. I'm going to focus on lakes first. And we have both data sets that work for data collected and what we call our ice out sampling. So that's spring sampling right after the ice is out. So in total, we have data for 397 lakes. And again, I'm going to focus on lakes other than Lake Champlain, since Matt Vaughn spoke about Lake Champlain this morning. So of those 47% of inland lakes sampled have total chloride readings above the detection level. So above that 2 milligrams per liter. We have about 16% of these lakes where we have enough data that we can actually detect a trend. And so we have seen significantly increasing trends for chloride concentration in Memphremagog, Carmi, Rescue, Caspian, Little Lake and Wells, Lake Morey, Tickle Naked Pond, and Shelburne Pond. So one of those in particular, Lake Morey, is interesting. So Lake Morey's watershed is only made up of only 1% of roads, but we have seen over the last 20 years that the chloride concentration has doubled. So that's one example. But you'll note, and as we've talked about, the proximity of the roads to the lakes matters. 6% of that 100-foot buffer around Lake Morey is road. So we have a number of lakes of those 397 where we have almost enough data to detect a trend. And so we suspect that there are increasing trends in approximately 96 of those lakes. Oddly, we've seen 2 lakes that have significantly decreasing total chloride trends, so both Willoughby and Seymour in the Northeast Kingdom. And just wanted to mention too that, although as Pete talked about and Matt talked about, although the chronic criteria is 230 milligrams per liter, impacts, may well occur or may occur well below those concentrations. So another data set that we have is collected through the summer. This is part of our lay monitoring program, which is a partnership program with Lake Champlain Sea Grant. So we have data on 105 of inland lakes. So 66 of those lakes had chloride concentrations above that detection limit. 28 were around 10 milligrams or slightly greater. 9 were above 20, 3 were above 30, and 1 had concentrations greater than 50. So we are seeing both increasing trends in concentrations and seeing evidence that our use of chloride in the watershed is impacting the concentrations in lakes. So we also talked a bit about our impaired waters. So here is a full list of our waters that are impaired as a result, our streams. We don't have any impaired lakes at this point, but we've mentioned Sunnyside, which is the impaired water where we recently completed the first total maximum daily load, or TMDL, for our chloride impaired streams. We also have 6 additional impaired streams where we're developing TMDLs. And then we listed, so we do our biennial, our listing cycle every other year. So one of those occurred in 2024 last year. We had 3 additional streams that were impaired as a result of chloride that were added to the impaired waters list. And then, based on data collection, we have 3 more that we anticipate listing during the next cycle in 2026, because we had significant runoff events and significant flooding in 23 and 24. Just suspected that those streams saw greater flow than what they would have typically. And so, we had seen higher numbers, but not yet reaching the level of impairment. But if we have a couple more years of data at normal stream flows, we anticipate that those will be impaired as well. Lastly, I know there were some questions about salt and sand storage. So we have data just from the Champlain Basin in Vermont. This is collected by a consultant in fall, winter of 22 and 23. So 126 towns, and this again is specific to municipalities. So 126 were contacted. So there was a response rate of roughly 94% with 118 towns. Okay, so of those towns that reported, there were 122 storage sites. So there were some sites that had multiple, or some towns, excuse me, that had multiple storage sites. So of those in the basin, there were no uncovered salt-only piles. So that's, I know, came up on Tuesday. 47 of the 122 storage sites were within 100 yards of surface waters. And then 27 of those 122 sites had uncovered sand salt piles, so combination where salt is added to sand. And then of those 27, 14 of those were within 100 yards of surface waters. So it's incomplete data for Vermont, but it does give you an idea of the proportions and how many facilities, at least in the Champlain Basin in Vermont. So I will turn it over to Pete. Get there.
And I know we have limited time, so, I can speak in generalities about H86 and the major sections of it, as we did for S29, and we can certainly come back if you would like and provide a more line by line markup of it.
I'm happy to have you focus on S29, trusting that these improvements are where that's where we're starting.
Okay.
And so the high level, and then it looks like you gave us a line by line, so maybe we'll have time for both.
We gave you a line by line, I think on 3.2. This has been a, pardon the pun, a slippery bill in that the versions have been changing frequently, and keeping up with the different versions has been has been an adventure. So we have markup, our recommended A&R markup on version 3.2, I think.
Yeah.
And I think it's currently at 4.4.
Okay.
So it's moved along, but I don't know the versioning history. We're not privy from the executive branch, we're not privy to all of the incremental tweaks.
Well, but and just to the point, it's now it's in Senate Judiciary. That means they're responsible now for these additional versions.
Correct.
Okay, so
Yes.
I'm thinking they're going to be focused on that liability section.
Yes.
So, okay.
And again, the core of the bill, the limited liability protection around for in exchange for attending and operating in a way using the BMPs as Chris laid out is the important part of the in our eyes, and the part that we really support. There was language in several areas that we provided testimony on. One area was around additional monitoring that was stipulated by the bill, binding the agency to do certain types of chloride monitoring when impairments or increasing concentrations were found. We've done, as Bethany described, we've done extensive monitoring. We've developed a good model between impervious surface coverage and that needs to be de-iced and the size of the watershed. And we have a really good targeting mechanism there to help direct our monitoring. And then when we do the TMDL work, we do extensive specific monitoring, putting conductivity meters out, developing flow duration curves. The Sunnyside Brook TMDL really was the learning experience for us on how to produce these TMDLs. And we're using that methodology specific to these new TMDLs and as we uncover new impaired waters. So we pushed back on the concept of the bill directing the secretary to do certain specific types of monitoring, because we really felt like, we have that ability. We recommended language that the secretary should do the appropriate monitoring. I don't have the exact language in front of me, but it is included in that markup of the bill. Another area that we disagreed with the committee and provided testimony on was around the tracking of salt import into the state, particularly looking back a number of years and trying to estimate tens of thousands of tons of salt brought into the state, either on an annual basis. We felt like it was more appropriate for the commercial applicators to be able to track, since they are the focus. Certainly the municipalities could do this as well, to estimate their salt usage. And hopefully, as a result of the training and the BMPs that are being recommended, we'll see a decrease in that usage over time. Again, it's a voluntary program. Like other voluntary programs, there'll be a startup period where initially we won't have that many commercial applicators doing it, but eventually we will be able to move more in that direction. And have a greater percentage of folks that are optimizing the application of salt. But again, because of the magnitude of the tonnage that's involved in this and the relatively slight differences, particularly early on in the program, that will be seen in that usage, it will be muted. We really feel like those differences will be muted out by the independent variable of the winters, and how the winters are varying, and the noise in the tracking would greatly just winter differences will greatly eliminate any gains in trying to develop quantitative predictions. Another area where we spoke both with the Senate Natural Committee and also Senate Transportation is in terms of the requirements for covering for municipalities to cover sand pile or salt piles and salted sand piles, particularly those that were within 100 yards of a receiving water. We agreed with Senate Transportation in terms of first assessing the problem. Bethany presented some preliminary numbers that haven't been field verified yet for the Champlain Basin side of things. We would like to produce a report that describes the extent of the problem, that describes the cost to municipalities, particularly small municipalities, associated with covering in a specific amount of time. And then thirdly, and importantly, looking at funding sources available to assist those municipalities in doing that coverage before we put up a hard date by which that needs to be done. Certainly in many cases, moving the pile, if it's the piles within 100 yards that we're focused on, 100 yards of surface waters, you know, in some municipalities, given a couple of years, they can incrementally start a new storage area in a different location. A lot of times those are associated with the public works garages, and for whatever reason, over time, a lot of public works garages seem to be close to rivers. So
Yeah, well, you might have heard me ask about a map. I mean, a lot of Vermont is within 100 yards of surface water.
Right.
So it would only be logical that, but also I just have to say, we're not looking at a lot of numbers, even if you're not exact in the numbers Bethany just gave us. It almost seems more important to me. This is low hanging fruit. These are, many towns have already done it.
Right.
And maybe there's 14 priority and 27 total. That's a number we can all wrap our heads around. Maybe we should just be helping those communities cover them.
it would be, we're recommending bringing a report back for the next session, bring a report back in December where we can go out and truly assess this and put a more accurate description of the costs associated to do this. I was talking with our colleagues out in the hall before we came in, and I think $750,000 was the estimate for a
Yeah,
covered
so
file.
Craig Giammarino again, today. Yeah, about $750,000 is the average price to lay concrete and build a structure tall enough to hold a large pile and get equipment in and out of. And our Municipal Assistance Bureau program does have a funding source. It's limited. Part of it comes from the Clean Water Board. And we do, one of the categories of awards is for salt coverage.
So it's kind of underway. And do you have a sense of how many, does one happen a year? How often does it?
I believe testimony that was offered in Senate from Joe Peregrine, who leads that division, was a handful, 6 or so a year are applied for, and then given limited funding, there may be a couple, 1 or 2 that are issued. I think that's trailing off these days, but.
And the final area, if I may, in terms of rolling out the commercial applicator program, we requested and changed the numbers that were originally provided in the bill for one FTE at A&R to manage this program, to develop those BMPs, to track implementation of this program, to keep up with the certification process for the applicators, and then $250,000 as a one-time contract to an external entity in Vermont to do that training, to actually run the training courses. There are a number of different folks that could do that work here in Vermont, and we would have a competitive bidding process around outsourcing the actual, standing up the training program and the materials and actually conducting those trainings. So there was some tweaking to the actual budget part of the bill.
Yeah, so you're not asking for a change, you're just asking for it to stay in.
Correct. These were the major differences, I'd say, as to where S29 was currently, and where H86 has begun its journey. So those are the 4 areas. And again, we have the track change version that we've provided, but happy to talk more specifically about those changes. But those are the 4 just general areas.
So I just don't really, I think if I understand this correctly, this training would be required every year. I feel like I saw that in the language yesterday, but then for one private contractor at 250,000, I don't know how that adds up. Help me understand how.
$250,000 would be the award to a outsourced contractor to do the training. For example, one idea would be Sea Grant. You know, if
I get
Seagrant
that.
provided
How
the
does
training, it would be the money to them.
That's a one-time allocation, but I'm talking about, how does it happen if year after year, if it's required every year to be certified?
If I can jump in, so the way that it would be set up is that the training itself would be paid for by fees to take the training. So like New Hampshire has a pricing system for, either a basic commercial salt applicator rate or a master salt applicator rate. And so once the training materials are developed, then the training would either, if the training is implemented by a third-party vendor, it would be based on the registration rate to take that training. Or potentially if we end up implementing it as a state, then we would be back to request a fee for participating in the training for the certification.
We know what that fee might be.
If it's analogous to what New Hampshire charges as the certification through their third-party entity, I think they charge $400 for a master application. I'll have to double check online and I can look at those, or it sounds like New Hampshire will be in next week to talk about their certification, but they have a separate program for municipalities, and then they have a program for commercial applicators.
And here in this bill, we're recommending that the municipalities get the training through the roads program. And commercial applicators would be outsourced to an entity. New Hampshire DES, our equivalent, New Hampshire outsources it to UNH, for example, and UNH does that training.
Is it structured, or could it be structured such that a person who achieves the master certification level becomes a trainer? It's like a trainer kind of
They
thing?
then train their employees. Mhm.
That's exactly right, Representative.
And how do they maintain their master certification? Do they have to keep coming back to the state for annual?
I believe there's a recertification requirement every 5 years. You have to take the full training, and there may be a more frequent sort of recertification, like refresher course that they have to take. I think it might be every other year.
Continuing ed type
That way we can
requirement.
slow it down and,
Mhm.
monetize it, let the folks do their thing.
Mhm.
Exactly.
And that I still have outstanding questions, but it is 5 past the hour. And so I want to be respectful of everyone's lunch hour. Thank you all for joining us for the whole presentation. That was great. And members will be back. Actually, I don't think we have anything on the agenda for tomorrow morning, but stay tuned. And we'll be on the floor at 1:00. We're adjourned.